Man testing his wolves if they will recognize the woman that raised them years ago. Shocking ending. In fact, one of the most intelligent animals in the world. Not only have they figured out that they will be better in packs and not being dim-witted trying to survive alone, they've worked out roles in the pack, orders, and training techniques. Alexandra was 35 years old and a local housewife. Alexandra, who was pregnant, needed it urgently because her parents had just picked fresh honey, and honey would improve sleep quality. As soon as it was dawn, she walked across the grove to the next village, since the distance was not too far. Alexandra went home with a large jar full of honey after dinner. Because of her pregnancy, she was very tired to walk, so she chose a more remote and closer path. Because the lush trees blocked the peripheral light of the evening and there were few people, the surroundings seemed a bit desolate. In a remote place, Alexandra found a she-wolf lying in a pile of leaves with a tired face. It stood up and sat down from time to time, snarled a few times, and closed its eyes as if it was dead. Alexandra immediately determined that the female wolf was giving birth. Alexandra knew that wolves were always fierce, but their principles of life were similar to those of humans, and they would only hurt those who hurt them. In order to avoid misunderstanding the she-wolf, Alexandra walked to the far right for fear of disturbing it. When Alexandra got closer to the wolf's den, suddenly a harsh motorcycle sound came from behind. Then she heard strange laughter. She didn't have time to think too much, and Alexandra immediately hid in the hidden bushes with something. Alexandra knew that those people were bandits, people who usually depended on robbery and stealing for a living. Alexandra knew that there was a high probability of encountering bandits on the path. She was taking chances, but she did not expect to encounter bandits. She lowered her head and touched her stomach with her left hand for fear that they would recognize her. A bandit said that hunting can also make money and suggested a change. Another bandit said he was planning to do so, although it was dangerous, but it could make money, and the bandit said it was time to make money. It turned out that when the bandits were discussing making money by hunting, they discovered that there was a female wolf in the wolf den. There was a saying that was right that it is natural world is a beautiful landscape in the eyes of tourists and money in the eyes of investors. The she-wolf who was giving birth at that time was money to the bandits. The bandits immediately stopped the car and took their usual tools and gradually surrounded the she-wolf. The astute she-wolf knew what the bandits were going to do, and she was in pain and weakness, but immediately alerted and opened its mouth. It wanted to use its usual ferocity to protect it and its children, to scare off the bandits. Helplessly, the pain in the abdomen made the she-wolf very weak. All the time, although it was powerless to attack them, it still stood up to resist the enemy with the best posture. The bandits got closer and closer with tools. Because this pregnant female wolf was extremely weak, and for the sake of the cubs, it would not act rashly, nor would it fight the other side to save its life as usual. The bandits knew this, so they dared to catch the she-wolf. Alexandra watched this scene from hiding behind the grass. She was anxious because she knew that once the she-wolf was caught by them, she would not be able to live. Alexandra hugged herself tightly when she thought that the child in the wolf's belly would be mistreated. She knew that no one wanted their child to be hurt. Alexandra looked at the terrified she-wolf, and she decided to help it even if she was in danger. One of the bandits said that the wolf was giving birth. No wonder they didn't pay any attention. Suddenly Alexandra greeted them. Alexandra ran out of the grass while smiling, staring at the wolf's den. When approached, she pretended to be surprised that she had just spotted the bandits and then boldly asked who they were. The bandits looked at each other, and one of them asked who she was and said the wolf was not hers. Alexandra was afraid that the bandits had bad intentions. If they wanted to do bad things, she could not resist. Soon Alexandra came up with a solution. She said solemnly that her husband was the most famous hunter in the area and that he had bought the she-wolf. She said that the wolf was raised by her husband and Alexander when she was just turned cub, and he was clung a lot with Alexandra. So he cherished it very much for fear that something would happen to it. So he asked her to check the situation that day. After hearing this, the bandits felt a little awe, and they looked at each other in fear. They defiantly said what would happen to her if they had to take the wolf. Alexandra laughed heartily. She knew she was lying, but she could only keep her composure. She knew that she couldn't let these greedy bandits leave by just words, so she laughed and said that she had to help her husband look after the wolf. But she also said that it was not easy for them and offered to give them the jar of honey. She said the jar of honey was natural and valuable. The bandits felt that Alexandra was an outspoken woman, and they were afraid of the hunter and wanted the jar of natural honey, so they felt they were not at a disadvantage. So they took the honey and left. Alexandra didn't relax until they were far away. Alexandra felt that an expensive jar of honey could be worth a life. During the confrontation between Alexandra and the bandits, the female wolf successfully gave birth to the cub. Watching the she-wolf give birth smoothly, Alexandra finally felt relieved. Before dark, she quickly went home. People used to say that good people will be rewarded. Alexandra helped the she-wolf, and the she-wolf always remembered. In a cold winter, 8 months later, the she-wolf led a horse to repay Alexandra. It was December. Originally, Alexandra's due date was January of the following year, but she gave birth earlier. The labor pains made Alexandra uncomfortable, forcing her to lie in bed crying. Her husband was anxious and distressed. In desperation, he used a tricycle to pull Alexandra to the midwife on a snowy day, because the midwife's leg was ill. She wouldn't go out on snowy days, and Alexandra's due date came early. So her husband was overwhelmed and unprepared. Bad things always happen in pairs, and the more you worry about something, the more it will happen. The Alexandra couple, who were advancing in the snow, encountered a herd of wild boars. They glared menacingly and grinned more fiercely than ever since it was snowing. At that time, the animals were hiding in the holes, and the wild boars were very hungry because they had not found food for a long time. So met two people, and they were excited. Thomas didn't have any protective gear, so he panicked. He knew that he couldn't beat those wild boars with his bare hands. When the 3 wild boars approached, Thomas knew it was too late and lay on his wife to protect her. He couldn't take care of anything else by then. Soon Alexandra heard a strong biting noise, and she saw a she-wolf. The she-wolf was fighting against the wild boars, and the she-wolf gathered strength and aimed at the wild boar and bit its legs. The wild boar was in great pain and ran away with serious injuries. The other wild boars were frightened when they saw this, so they all ran away after looking at the she-wolf. She immediately recognized that it was the she-wolf she met on the side of the road half a year ago. Alexandra was still afraid due to the sudden attack of wild boars just now. After seeing the she-wolf fighting, she was not only frightened, but also in pain. Before she could think about it, Alexandra fainted. When she woke up, she found that she had been lying on the bed at the midwife's house and that her baby had been born. She asked where the wild boars and the she-wolf with her follow had gone. Alexandra woke up from a nightmare. She opened her eyes and said this. Thomas smiled and explained to her patiently. It turned out that after Alexandra fainted, the snow became heavier and heavier, making it difficult for the tricycle to move forward, and even unable to move afterward. Thomas didn't know what to do because Alexandra was dangerous at the time. Just as Thomas was very anxious, the she-wolf called for a horse from a distance. The dark horse gave Thomas a look and wagged its tail. Thomas was very grateful for it. With time pressed, he pondered why the she-wolf had suddenly appeared and brought a horse to help them. After tying up the car, he rode his horse quickly to the midwife. She was moved to tears when she learned that it was the she-wolf who saved her and her children. She didn't expect the she-wolf to be so affectionate and righteous and give its life to save her. Suddenly she heard a wailing sound, so she looked out the window. The she-wolf was sitting in the snow looking out the window. Since the she-wolf was worried about Alexandra's poor fertility, it had been escorting them and waiting for her outside the door for fear that something would happen to her. At that time, the white snow was still falling, but their hearts were always connected. The wolf's heart was purer than snowflakes. This wasn't the first time. Jody was quite aware of what she was about to commit to. The wolf didn't like her moving towards it. It tried to get away, but its foot was clamped in a trap. She stopped and looked over her shoulder. She heard something quietly moving behind her. Then she noticed a silhouette emerge from the trees. Then she noticed another appear, and then another. They were all sizing her up before inching closer. She could see their breath in the air. Ever since she was small, she loved animals. She came from Colorado and had come to be obsessed with canines. She had always thought about what she would do if she ever met a wolf in the wild. So after being an adult for several years, her dream finally came true. But it was slightly different than he had thought it would be. She had it all planned out in her head, but that didn't matter. These wolves didn't care. Jody was nervous when she volunteered at the Colorado Wolf and Wildlife Center. She didn't know what kind of experience it would offer, but she knew that it was her desire to meet a real wolf. When her chance finally presented itself, she knew it would also mean that she could help out these animals in need, but it wasn't quite what she expected. Her first job wasn't exactly pleasant. She would have to cut up animal carcasses for the wolves and clean out the toilet tanks. It wasn't what she was thinking of when she volunteered. She was more than happy to do these jobs in the hopes of helping the animals, but above all else, she still wanted to meet her wolf. She didn't know when she was going to see them, if she even would. Wolves usually hunt in packs, but even when they're alone, they have a very nasty bite. Their jaws can deliver over 600 pounds of force per square inch. It's twice that of a pit bull, to put things in perspective. They don't just rely on their jaws. They also have incredible intelligence. They can outthink the prey they are hunting, and Jody would learn this soon enough. The center where Jody had volunteered was close to a small town called Divide, which had a lot of cool places to visit, like the education amphitheater and walking trails. Just outside of the town was the center, which had 35 acres of land, and that had lots of small enclosures for tame wolves and wolf hybrids. The wolves that lived outside the enclosures would only be visited at specific times. One of the purposes of the center was to clear up the stigma about wolves. People often fear wolves and place snares and traps for the wolves to get caught in. Gray wolves have dropped in population due to this stigma and fear. Wolves are seen as cold predators. The conception of the big bad wolf has been cemented in people's minds. After weeks of volunteering at the shelter, a senior staff member approached her with good news. Finally, Jody would be fulfilling her dream. She was so excited she could feel her heartbeat. She followed the staff member out of the enclosures into the forest a ways away from the center. They were being cautious due to the wolves' varying reactions to someone new coming into their territory. Jody had no idea how things would escalate. Jody was so excited about what was to happen. She was now in their territory, and any minute she'd see one of them. Other than the crumple of snow underfoot, Jody noticed that it was unnaturally quiet. She knew it was too late to turn back. She had to keep her reservations about her choice. She could see only her footprints in the snow behind her, but then she saw it. Jody could see a lone wolf lying down in a spot. It was a timber wolf, one of the smallest wolves, but it was still huge compared to Jody. She smiled and jumped back with surprise. She wanted to get closer, but the guide told her to stay still while they called for more help. She knew that she wouldn't disappoint. She would do what she needed to. Even though the park was fully enclosed, they still received a lot of backlash from farmers who lived in the town nearby, who were afraid that the wolves would escape and jeopardize their livestock. Jody knew what had happened, and her blood began to boil. Someone had set this snare on purpose. Jody could see that the trapped steel jaws had imprisoned 2 of the wolf's toes. They were swollen, but he wouldn't lose the paw if she could free him. But she had to do it quickly. Ironically enough, even though the animal was snared, it seemed to be completely calm. It lay completely still in the grass, as though it had just stopped for a breather. However, the heavy breathing of the wolf indicated distress. Suddenly, the calm demeanor changed when Jody approached. The wolf became feral. Jody knew she needed help, but when she reached out, the wolf grew more treacherous. Suddenly she heard a sound behind her. Quickly she picked up the board. She intended to use it as a shield to approach the trapped animal, but the wolf didn't take kindly to this approach. As soon as the wolf saw Jody hold up the board, he began to go nuts. For some reason, the animal viewed the object as a real threat. Still, Jody attempted to approach. Her guide stood close by, gun at the ready. But this just distressed the animal further. It had no idea what Jody's intentions were, and neither did the rest of its pack, who were still closing in on them. As Jody approached the animal, she took long pauses between moves, until she was close enough to touch the wolf's trapped foot. She placed the board between herself and the wolf. On doing this, the wolf desperately tried to back up. Scared the animal would hurt himself, Jody stopped in her tracks. Slowly the wolf became more at ease. Then Jody did something remarkable. She leaned forward and applied enough pressure to the trap to release the wolf's foot. He leaped up and ran off into the trees, but the rest of the pack didn't follow him. Keikoa, one of the other wolves who had been watching her the whole time, approached her cautiously and was then followed by his sister Sakara. Jody's heart skipped a beat. These beasts were even more colossal than the wolf she had just freed. Then something inside her told her to sit down in the snow in a non-threatening posture and wait for them to come to her. But as they drew nearer, the female wolf took the lead and did something nobody expected. The she-wolf, Sakara, very slowly lowered her face to Jody's. Then she sniffed her. Suddenly, her great pink tongue darted out of her mouth, and she leaned unnervingly close to Jody. Soon after, the rest of the pack, led by Keikoa, followed his sister's lead to inspect the new human, sitting absolutely still in the snow. Now Sakara was almost on top of her. Jody's instant bond with the wolves at the center is extraordinary, and the other staff were thrilled. They promptly asked her to continue her work at the center, and she has now been working closely with the wolves for several years. She has developed a deep connection with Keikoa. She thinks it's because he witnessed her act of kindness when another wolf was caught in a snare, and Jody and the wolves couldn't be happier. But what is Keikoa and Sakura's story? This particular pair of wolves, Keikoa and Sakura, were siblings who had been adopted together in hopes that they would be a teaching tool to educate the community. This is today's story.